So after this lawyer wanted me to, was telling me that I had to go out of the country and then come back in. I mean, I later realized he never said one single thing about political asylum. I mean, he just sort of skirted over that whole issue and tried to make it sound like I couldn't get political asylum, but I could legally immigrate. And he started talking about immigration as if that's what my whole thing was, when everyone knew that that's not what it was. And after I talked to him, then, then I left, and then I started getting pressured from Bruce and Corinne about what was I going to do. What choices what kind of choice was I going to make? And then I signed my son up for the library and to use the library, and I noticed people just sort of thought it was hilarious. Some of the people there already knew who I was or acted like they did. And sort of just watched us. And I was followed everywhere I went with my son. I walked through the town with my son up on my shoulders, and I was being stalked by FBI, Department of State, and our CMP. Here I was trying to keep my son happy and try to do a few normal things, and we were being made fun of and stalked and set up. The next thing that happened is, because of this severe bronchitis, I had to get some kind of an antibiotic for me and my son. And at that point, Bruce began pressuring me. He wanted to try to catch me doing something illegal. And so I think that they figured, well, how do we get rid of the fact that we just did this horrible thing and not giving me a political asylum hearing? So then all of a sudden, he's trying to set me up to, or hoping that he can catch me in a crime. And I wasn't a criminal, so he never did catch me in a crime. But he began putting pressure on me in the sense of, here my son is extremely ill, and here I was sick, and we needed an antibiotic. And I told him I would pay him back in the future, but I didn't know when that would be. And he started to say, well, what are you going to do for me? I need you to do something for me. And I said, I don't know. I can clean, or I can do dishes, or I could do some work around the house. And he's like, no, I'm thinking of something else. And he kept hinting every suggestion I came up with that was lawful, that was something that you could do that was just normal. He didn't like, and he kept hinting that he wanted me to offer him some kind of sexual favor. And I didn't do it. He kept pressuring me, and he's like, well, I guess your son's just going to be sick. And I said, all I can say is, please help me with this, and I think, you would have a good feeling. What would you do if you were in this situation? And then he stopped at a grocery store, and another federal worker came out of that store, and he kind of nodded and shook his head at the grocery worker like he hadn't been able to catch me into agreeing to commit any kind of crime. I mean, like, in agreeing to offer a sexual favor or prostituting myself in order just to get medicine for my son. And when I was with them at their house, they said, go ahead and set up an appointment with a speech therapist for your son, because my son still had problems articulating his speech. And I thought maybe that would be something that I could do for my son there. And they said he didn't have to be a citizen. They would see him regardless of what the issue was. And since I was technically a guest, I wasn't there on insufficient funds. However, I was still trying to get political asylum. And that was a fact that was just being ignored, and that's something that I hadn't forgotten about. And my plan I was still making plans to go to Toronto. And then Bruce and Corinne told me that I should talk to this person they knew, or look at this ad, because they needed a nanny, and maybe I could work for them, and then they would support my insurance and my application for immigration to Canada and all of this stuff. And I wasn't really sure what they were talking about, but they were so insistent that I go to this interview that I did. And the woman gave me a written out contract saying, and I said, well, don't you have to leave the country and then apply for something like that, even to get paid at all and be in Canada and be paid for anything? And she said, no, if I sponsor it, then, she said, I've done it before in the past, and if I sponsor it, it's not a big deal. And she tells me her son is a police officer. Or I found out that not her son, her husband is an RCMP. And her husband is an RCMP, and the people that I was living with, Bruce and Corinne, they're the ones who referred me to her to talk to her. And she was a nurse at that hospital. So all of a sudden, it's looking more and more like Bruce and Corinne are RCMP. And, Middleton people. So they were trying to set me up. And on the night, I basically found somebody who said that we could stay with him and do some work in the hotel, in his hotel possibly, or that he actually said that he might just help us out financially, like might just give us some cash. And I had this idea that if I could go to a food bank, just pick up a little bit of food, and if somebody gave me just a really small cash amount, a couple $100, I could drive to Toronto and try to get my political asylum. Because, was I really supposed to think that I'm going to get political asylum in Penticton? They just told me illegally to go back across the border and made a big fraudulent excuse about why. So I still had a legal right to ask for political asylum. But because of what they had done, I didn't want to end up in jail, because they're criminals. Why should my son and I, who have been tortured, end up in their jail because they are committing crimes? And colluding with United States criminals. So my intention was still to keep driving, to keep moving, and then make my application again. And basically, after I met this woman whose husband was a cop and she was a nurse at the hospital, I was then talking to this other person who said that my son and I could stay at this hotel, he'd give us our own room, and he might be able to help us financially. So it looked like there was a feasible way to make things work until I made my claim again in a different jurisdiction of different part of Canada. And so it looked like everything was going to work out with that. But when Corinne and Bruce found out that somebody else was going to be helping me out with a place to stay, they didn't like it. And I knew that Corinne called the social worker. And then they called the RCMP to basically, she said, where are you going? She basically, the night before, she knew what she was doing. Because she started crying. She was watching Joan of Arc on the television. It was a movie with that sort of Russian-looking woman, whose name is escaping me at the moment. And she's watching Joan of Arc, and then she's looking at my son's warped, curled up toenails, and she was rubbing them and contemplating them, like she was looking at them. I knew she knew. You could not look at what had happened to my son and his damages and not know that something horrific had happened to him. And yet they're turning us in to go back to this horrific situation, which is what they did. Because then the next day, I was leaving. I'd already told them I'd found a place. And she said, well, where are you going right now? Because I had to wait until that man was at his hotel. I told her, she's the only person who asked, and she said, where are you going right now? And I said, at Walmart. I'm just going to kill some time at Walmart. until he is in his, he's back at the hotel. He was a hotel owner. He owned his own hotel. And I said, when he's back at his hotel, then we have everything ready to go. And I know that as soon as I left, they contacted police, and sure enough, after we looked around at some things for about an hour or 2 hours, maybe it was less than an hour, maybe a half an hour, suddenly I was being approached by police, Penticton police, RCMP again, in the Walmart. And there were a bunch of women, really nasty women, that were around who looked really happy that my son was being taken from me. They looked Italian, and they also looked French, and I knew they were Catholic. And I knew that those women who thought that this was so amusing and harassed me while the police were leading me out of that store, I knew that those women, they made it very obvious they knew who I was. They made it very clear from their expressions that they were sadistically excited that this was happening to us. And it looked like they had known. I just had this feeling. I wouldn't say it looked like from their expression. I had a feeling that they knew about me and they'd known what was going on for a long time. And the officer, the police officer, had social workers there who said, take your things out of your car, whatever you need, and you're going to drive your car, and your son's going to go in our car. And I had already taught my son the meaning of time and how long it takes to get from one place to another. And so he had an idea of approximate timing. Not a concrete idea of time, but an approximate idea. And I told my son, don't worry, it's going to be just 15 minutes and I'll see you again. Well, he was screaming bloody murder, and as soon as we were back in that Penticton immigration place, I could hear my son on the other side of the wall screaming hysterically for me. He was hysterical. My son had been raised with attachment parenting. He'd never been out of my sight, except for with a couple trusted people. He was not just crying like kids cry when they have somebody babysit them for a while. He cried like he was being tortured. And honestly, that's what Canada did to my son. You, Canada, you tortured a little boy. And you colluded. Your officials colluded on a criminal level with criminals that are in the United States. And both your country and the United States need to be held accountable by a larger organization for what you have done collectively. You've committed crimes of torture. And even if the United States did not sign the respective declaration, Canada, you did. And you tortured people anyway. You have a lot of UN cameras still running around your country. Or is it just Middleton's now? I mean, are they related? They tortured. I had to break away from addressing general public to addressing the individuals who are criminals that will most likely see this in non-traditional ways. Either probably not through my YouTube uploads. And for the other people that are watching this, they tortured my son. My son has damages that can never be accounted for, can never be paid for, could never be compensated for justly, and yet he deserves every single benefit and monetary compensation that is available at the highest possible allowance that the government, that the justice system would allow.